Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this, the first of 4 Blue Triangle training videos dealing with Core Web Vitals. My name is Mark Kosierowski, and I am with the Customer Success team. We also have Ciaran. Ciaran, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey, it's Ciaran here, Customer Success Manager for EMEA. So I currently work with customers in retail, financial, and across other verticals. We help various teams from the front end to the back end with best practices in the Blue Triangle platform. And the aim for the relationship is to help foster an internal environment of continuous experience optimization, both for the company internally and also to ensure that the end user's digital journey happens without friction. Thanks everyone for attending today and looking forward to sharing some knowledge.
So today we're going to be giving you a quick overview of Core Web Vitals, what they represent, and how Blue Triangle can help you to investigate them on your website. For the most part today, we'll be focusing on going over each of the Core Web Vitals and then diving into the first major one, which is Largest Contentful Paint. When we talk about Core Web Vitals, we're referring to the newest push by Google, or newest as of a year or so, push by Google on performance metrics. Now, each of the Core Web Vitals represents a unique facet of the customer experience. Largest Contentful Paint represents the loading or the performance as we are thinking about it today. So how long does it take your biggest image on your site to load? First input delay measures your interactivity or responsiveness. How long does it take your customer, when a customer clicks on something on your site, for it to respond? And finally, you have the cumulative layout shift, which is measuring your visual stability. I always use the example of, have you ever clicked on a website and ended up clicking on the wrong thing because the page shifted down? That kind of level of frustration. That's what the CLS is measuring, just how much of your site is shifting during its load time. Now, each of these metrics are adding up to the core customer experience on your website. Not only is improving these metrics one of the keys to great customer experience, it also ties where you are ranked on the Google SEO rankings. When you go to a search engine, you type in like anything, and is your site going to be one of the first couple? The Core Web Vitals directly plays into that. So today we're going to be focusing on LCP. What is it? How do we affect it? How Blue Triangle can help with it? What is Largest Contentful Paint? Largest Contentful Paint is what we would consider, it's probably the most traditional of the three, the Core Web Vitals. This is more of a performance metric comparatively. It's looking at how long it takes your largest file, image file, or font file potentially to render on the page. On this chart right here, you can see it's broken up into 4 different parts. First is time to first byte. Basically, how long does it take the document to load? This is like an initial HTML load that you'll see usually in your waterfall graphs, usually that largest bar at the top that always takes longer than everything else does. So that's going to be kind of the first thing that's going to be happening for that. The second is resource load delay. This is taken up by any style sheets, your .css files. These need to load before the images can start coming in. That's where we have those purple bars on the graph. Those are your style sheets. Usually one of those will have indicating your LCP data in it that will need to load. So that's where we get to that third bar, which is your resource load time. And you can see it's pointing to the green bar, which is basically, think of that as your LCP. It's going to be triggered by one of the style sheets, more than likely, and it will start the load process there. So among these, you can usually have be either an SVG file, a JPEG, a PNG. One of those is going to be the LCP image. Now, by Largest Contentful Paint, we mean the image that's the biggest on the site. So like if you're in your viewport, how big is that image on your site? We're going to be constantly looking for what the biggest image is. So if that image is changing over time, it's going to basically be looking and saying, oh, this is bigger, oh, this is bigger, and basically until we find the image that is the largest, and then it's going to record the time it takes for this to render, which is that fourth bar. Once that image has been loaded, when is it visible by the customer? And then all of that yellow bars is the JavaScript that are effectively loading in order to get that LCP image rendered. And that's where we get element render delay time. So all of these things basically factor into how your LCP image is coming up on the site. So the question is, how can we help? Now, one of the things just to keep in mind really quickly before we get into the next screen is, because this is a Google metric, just keep in mind that this is not being calculated on Safari browsers. This is going to be purely a Google metric, so you're going to only see this on Chrome in general. So just keep that in mind. How can Blue Triangle help with this? So one of the things that Blue Triangle can do is we have our RUM data where we can pull up individual sessions for you to be able to look at this traffic. Now, I've kind of tried to break this up using some of our demo data, basically looking at how going back and forth between here and here, we can kind of take a look at each of these areas and how those can be improved. So just looking at it right out the gate, you can see I've split it up by the HTML document up here at the top. That's what we were talking about when we were talking about this blue bar initially, that time to first byte. You need this to load, you need this HTML document to load in. We have these style sheets over here underneath the HTML document. Those are those .css files. Those are required in order to load. They have all your information on them. Those need to load in. Then you have your image files. So anything that's got the SVG, .png, .jpeg, those all need to load. Those are all your images that are loading. And one of those is your LCP image. And the JavaScript then are going to deliver those to get to that green line right here, which is what we're going to see on the BTT RUM data in order to complete the LCP and basically say LCP has been completed. So those are the basics of what we're showing on this graph. The big thing now we're going to be going through is how do we affect this? How do we make this better? How do we shorten the time it takes to get to that green line? So the first thing that it basically is split up into 4 categories. The first one is first byte. So time to first byte. So how do we make this process right here at the top faster? Second is how do we improve resource load delay? How do we make it so that the resources are being loaded in a more optimized fashion? Third thing is resource load time, basically reducing the friction between the devices and the resources that are in play. So how long do these take to load? And how do we make that load time shorter? And then finally, element render delay. Basically, once the LCP image is loaded, how long does it take to get to that else? How long does it get for the JavaScript to actually display it on the page? So we're just going to kind of go through those categories today, and then at the end of this, we'll have some Q&A. We'll start off with first byte. So the first area is first byte. You can see the HTML document is loading, and that you can see that underneath the waterfall, nothing is loading until that is completed. So how do we make that better? Well, there's a couple different ways we can do that. First of which is, implementing content delivery networks. Make sure the distance between your server and the end user is shorter. Make sure that the data is distributed more evenly across the network. This allows your customer to get to a node that is closer to them, thus reducing the amount of that server time that needs to go through between you and the customer. The second is server processing. So we need to, this is usually a lot easier said than done, I would say. But if you can optimize the backend programming, you can optimize things like make sure you have load balancers, make sure your web servers are using up-to-date software. There's a lot of things you can do kind of on the back end to be able to make this go a little bit quicker. You can optimize your database queries. Make sure your database isn't retrieving data it doesn't need for a particular load. Basically, every little bit helps if your database is kind of a mess, and it's going to make that initial HTML load a lot slower. You can increase the response to the client. So basically, this is a methodology change. So if the concept is if you can deliver the cached responses earlier, that means the rest of the request is going to go through a lot quicker. Basically, the concept being that if you can deliver a cached response faster, that means that anything else that needs to be processed can go through in the back, like it can basically be processed in the background. The concept being we want to get to LCP as fast as possible. We want to get to this as quickly as we need to. So anything we can cache, will make things a lot faster. And then finally, we want to reduce the size of the request. So anything like font sizes, image optimization, we want those to be as small as possible. Moving into, and this is all just stuff that's coming from the HTML document, basically. Stuff that we want to basically make as quick, we want to basically increase that speed, have as little things going on there so that this bar at the top can be as fast as possible. Because you can see, like this is a large portion of what was being done is server side response rate. This is all stuff that we want to make sure is as quick as possible. This is also the hardest part. Doing anything with first byte is always a lot more complicated because usually it involves a lot of sweeping changes that need to be made. But it is something to keep in mind because it is a large portion of the things that go into how long it takes the LCP to work. We've seen a lot of times with customers where they'll be like, well, I'm delivering the LCP as quickly as possible. I'm delivering. I've got really small style sheets, but their time to first byte is like a second and a half, 2 seconds, and you have to point out and you say, well, until you get this down, we're not gonna be able to do much better than that. So it's not always the easiest thing, but it is something to keep in mind for fixing that. Second one we're going to look at is resource load delay. So how do we make it so that these style sheets are as quick as possible? The idea behind this being we want to make it so that the LCP resource, any time between when these style sheets start and when the LCP resource begins to load, is time that we could be saving. So what can we do to make that process shorter? So what we can do here is we can optimize the load order. So we want to check to see what is loading and where is your LCP being triggered, and can we trigger it as fast as possible. One of the things you'll note on here is that immediately after the HTML document is done, you can start to see here's where these CSS files are starting here at the top. But you can also see that, notice that SVG images are being triggered and PNG images are being triggered almost immediately as well. So these have already begun their load process. You'll note that they got blocked until the LCP image is done loading. The white here represents blocking. So some of these are being blocked until the LCP image has been done completed loading. So you'll be able to see, so the key here is being able to see what is loading. Is your LCP image being triggered as soon as possible? Are the information from the style sheets, so these style sheets up here, being loaded, are loading other resources like fonts or other smaller images first? Are they doing those before the LCP is done or has even started? It's the kind of the key is where we want to get that LCP loaded as quickly as possible. So we want the style sheets to be either as small as possible or to be loading that LCP asynchronously along with everything else. So one of the key things also to keep in mind with this is a lot of people will say, oh, we'll just lazy load everything. Well, that's okay. It's not a bad idea for some of these images. But one of the key things to keep in mind is that if you end up lazy loading your LCP image, it's going to load a lot later, actually, because basically it won't load until somebody's scrolled down the page a little while, and it can end up loading way later and give you extreme times for your LCP image. So that'll end up loading way later. So if you're going to lazy load some of the smaller things that need to be loaded later on in the page. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That'll help you out. Just make sure, I can't stress enough, do not lazy load your LCP image. That'll cause a lot of issues. Work on fetch priority. So a lot of times in your code, you'll have a fetch priority for your LCP image or all your images for that matter. So, and that's great. Make sure your LCP image has the highest fetch priority. The problem we'll see a lot of times though is sometimes people will have high fetch priority on everything. They'll have the same priority for all their images. So the key is to make sure your LCP has a higher priority than all the other images. Make sure that's loading first. It's vital that image loads before everything else does. I believe I touched on this earlier, but make sure everything is loading asynchronously if possible. Synchronous loading will always slow you down. You can see that from here, see how the CSS file here at the end is done loading, and then you can see down here, you can always draw a line basically from a waterfall graph down to the next image. You can see that these CSS images require these CSS to load. And then those need to load in order for these JavaScript to begin loading. These are synchronous loads effectively. So these need to be loaded in order for this to go through. We want to minimize that as much as possible as we're going along, because we want to make things go as fast as possible. The more things synchronously load, see, while all of this is loading synchronously, it's all been triggered synchronously, or asynchronously, I should say. Everything's loading at the same time, and you can get your stuff loaded a lot quicker. You'll also notice a lot, you won't have like one resource that's holding up everything. You won't have that smoking gun resource that's saying, this is the problem, this is what's holding us up. Next, you want to make sure your files are discoverable early on. Basically, make sure if the attributes can be set up in the HTML for the LCP to load earlier, then do that earlier. Try to avoid having your LCP load dynamically through a JavaScript. We'll see that a lot of times where a JavaScript needs to load, and it'll load dynamically, and that'll start the load process way later on. So you'll have your LCP loading like after a bunch of other images are loading, because it's waiting for that dynamic JavaScript to load it. So basically, the more static you can make that, the better off you are. Again, it kind of comes down to, don't lazy load your LCP because it can get stuck. This is the same concept. You want to make sure that there's no dynamic JavaScript that's basically calling on the LCP in order for it to go through. Moving on. So I got two more things we want to go over real quickly, and then we'll get to kind of question and answer on this. The first thing is resource load time. This is the number 3. The ways we want to reduce that is we want to reduce friction between the user's device and the resource. So we want to reduce the size of the resources, reduce the distance of the resources, and ensure we're caching properly. So reducing the load time on reducing the size of the resource. This is basically stuff you've probably heard if you have me as a customer success manager. You'd know that I'm saying this all the time. Make sure you're using proper image formats. PNG format is usually a lot slower than other formats because it can't compress. So you've got, like you can see in here, there's PNG formats that take a long time to load. These images can't be compressed, so just make sure that if you are using them, you're using them as small images. You want to reduce the distance of the resource. We talked about this in Time to First Byte, but having content delivery network to deliver your images can be the key, because not only are those images being optimized, but they can be delivered from the shortest point possible. And finally, you want to make sure you're ensuring good caching practice. Again, we talked about this in Time to First Byte, but if the customer has the data already cached to you and you're bringing the resource back from cache, there's virtually no time spent on this. So make sure your caching is good. This can help a lot with getting those times to first byte, or time to largest contentful paint, down over time. Last thing I want to just talk about briefly is talk about element render delay. This is that 4th section. This is after the largest contentful paint has already been loaded, and now it just needs to be rendered. So basically with this, similar things to what I've talked about already. You want to reduce the blocking time of resources in the head of the file. So basically any third-party tags can slow that down. Make sure social media is not being loaded is being loaded at the same time as your LCP. If you can, try to push those things out. You want to get your LCP loaded first, and then everything else can load afterwards. That's a bigger priority. If you're running A/B tests during that time, you want to make sure that your A/B test isn't interfering with loading key resources on your site. You want to reduce the busy periods in your JavaScript. Basically, this is the whole point where you talk about, okay, is there JavaScript running while the LCP image is loading? If that's the case, try to cut that out. You don't want JavaScript loading while this is loading. Or if you do, make sure it's small JavaScript that can be reduced down as much as possible. Make sure your CSS files are being used. This is really important. If there's a CSS file you have on your system and it's not being used, it can block the LCP load. Make sure anything on your site, that's good advice for literally every object on your site. Is there a font file that's not being used? Is there an image file that's not being used? Is it being loaded in the HTML but it's not coming out? These are all things that we want to look at and make sure that you're loading everything you need to be loading as quickly as possible and in the right place. And ultimately, those are the things that we're going to be looking for in the BTT RUM section to be able to point to these things and say, are you sure this is where you want this? Or are you sure this is, or do you need to have this loading in this place? So with that, I am going to turn over to the Q&A section. Ciaran, if you want to pick this up a little bit.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So I've had a quick question in chat, which is sort of where in the portal can we actually see this for my room traffic? In order to do that, I go to your real user monitoring section, through to the web browser, and then onto the aggregate waterfall. So you'll be able to see an object level detail of all of the resources that are loading on your page. And as Mark said, you can then start to actually investigate what resources are coming through before your largest contentful paint resource are coming through. So I will basically ask the floor if there's any sort of questions, and if not, we've got a couple of prepared questions to go through. So if there's no questions in chat, I'll just go ahead with the first one, which is, what if my LCP is already great across the site? So in general, your website is, the digital landscape are ever changing. Even if the scores are perfect, basically understanding and getting some sort of clarity into what's actually affecting your LCP is a very valuable sort of exercise to go through for your organization. Visitors to websites do not like waiting generally. And if you're not revealing that main content quickly, visitors are more likely to go to a competitor. And having a really quick LCP means that users are getting your relevant content and aren't waiting around too much. For example, your LCP score might be great, but your closest competitor could be potentially beating you by sort of a factor of 10 or a factor of 5. Having that sort of, having the ability and the knowledge and the process of going in and having a look at your LCP and maximizing it as much as you can, compared to your competitors is a great exercise. Because at the end of the day, if Google is ranking you the same on sort of SEO, these technical metrics can actually be a differentiator between yourself and a competitor. So we've got a quick question from Mark. So can you briefly tell us why your LCP line is where it is visually? So at this point, we're basically trying to understand why the LCP has been painted so far down the waterfall.
Sure. So in this example, basically the image is loading actually a lot earlier than this, and it's being rendered by JavaScript later on. So it's probably being loaded by the JavaScript down the page. So this is the whole thing we were going over earlier, where this is, the LCP is loaded like earlier than it actually is rendered is the big thing. So it's very rare you'll see the actual LCP image right up against the LCP line, because that's just not how it works. The resource is loaded earlier, and then a JavaScript usually delivers that LCP image. So that's where we're talking about, where we're saying there's resource load time, and then there's element render delay time. So like basically there's this JavaScript that's got to process the LCP and basically push it to the viewport. So in every example of this, you want to know which of your images are your LCP, and then figure out from there which of your JavaScript are loading the LCP. And then once that JavaScript is loaded, that's where this line will take place, and everything else can load afterwards. So other images can load in afterwards effectively.
Thanks, Mark. So we've got another question we can cover off as well. So is it possible basically to show how the LCP image is loading in real time, i.e., going to the browser and showing the LCP exactly where it's loading? There's a couple of ways to do this, and obviously there's a couple of caveats and things to keep in mind once you're actually doing this. So the short answer is yes. So Google actually provides on their Core Web Vital website a snippet of code, and what that will do is that will give you some of your candidates for your largest contentful paint image. Now, one thing to keep in mind whilst actually doing that is obviously that's a measurement for sort of one page load, and what's the breakdowns that Google gives you in that one page load might not be actually indicative of the experience for 100,000 of your users, for example. This is where sort of trending that data and actually using the portal can actually assist with measuring and actually diagnosing what's happening with the LCP metric. We have tools that can sort of inform and trend over time what the most likely candidate is, in terms of your LCP. So potentially, are we looking at, a high first byte time? Because what's happening for one single page load might not necessarily be happening for the users. If you want to dedicate resources to getting a better overall LCP, this obviously requires sort of a higher fidelity of data, so that we can actually say these improvements that we're making to LCP are affecting a large number of users. And that constant stream of reliable data is something that obviously Blue Triangle can provide. I don't see any other questions in chat for now, Mark. But obviously, if this session's been useful, to yourselves. And if you'd like to learn more about, how Blue Triangle and, how to improve your LCP, then please sort of get in touch with us. Obviously, some of the people on the call right now will have customer success managers, and we can obviously bring these up in our regular cadences. But if not, obviously, feel free to connect with myself and other members of my team on LinkedIn and get that conversation started as well.
And thank you all for coming today. Like I said, we'll be doing 3 more of these trainings. The next training will be on first input delay. After that, CLS. And then we're going to be going into some more of the reporting that goes on the Blue Triangle side, where we can show you all of this information kind of bundled up together. Thank you all for coming today. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks all for joining.